Welcome to ECD's September webinar. We're so excited that you're joining us today. This topic that we're going to cover is near and dear to my heart, and I was blessed to meet Dr. Rob Dixon a few months ago, and we are excited to have him join us today. Dr. Rob Dixon, who I'm going to call Rob for the remainder of our webinar time together, he has been working with InterVarsity Institute. He is a senior fellow with InterVarsity Institute. He is also the associate regional director in Central California and Southern Nevada. But if that's not enough, he's also adjunct faculty at Fresno Pacific University and Fuller Theological Seminary. He lives in Central California with his wife, Amy, and 4 children. And he wrote the book, Together in Ministry. And I'm going to put this out there now for those of you listening in. I have read the book. It's fantastic. And we would love to offer it to you. And so we have a form that's going to be included in the chat. If you are interested in receiving a free copy of this book, that's a limited time offer from our office. Please click the link that's going to be in the comments, complete that simple form, and we will get that book to you. So without further ado, welcome Rob to our webinar. We are thrilled to have you with us.
Well, it's exciting to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity, and man, thanks for your generosity and sharing my book with everyone on the call. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, the title of your book is Together in Ministry, and it's something that, as I did a little digging, has been a passion of yours for a while. So how did you come to care about this topic of women and men serving together in a partnership in ministry? What motivated you to write this book?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of twists and turns to that story, but I'll just give the highlights, or a couple of the highlights anyway. So I've been in ministry for I think it's my 28th year with InterVarsity, and a lot of things have changed in that time period. Lots, strategies come and go, people come and go, all that. But one of the constants in my ministry life has been I've always worked alongside women in the context of my ministry. And just about every configuration you can think of, I've been supervised by women. I've supervised women as peers, and short-term partnerships and long-term kind of team contexts. And pretty uniformly, those partnerships have been just a gift to me, life-giving, joyful, wonderful experiences. But somewhere along the way in those 28 years, I started to notice that no one was talking about the dynamics of women and men working together. No one trained me on that. And for an organization like InterVarsity, we love our training. And it was sort of weird that it just wasn't something we were talking about, the dynamics of working together. And so I started to sort of be bugged by that maybe, and just let that sort of bother me, and realized I think I want to do something about that. And so my hypothesis became, if we can train on women and men working together in ministry, not only would we avoid some of the negative stories that we see all too frequently in the news about, pastors that abuse their positions and things like that, we might also see our mission accelerate, because as women and men work together, God's mission moves forward more quickly on a greater basis, right? So that was my hypothesis, and I don't know how the Lord works for everyone on the call, but one of the things the Lord's always done in my life is when I get bugged by something, God says, well, how about you do something about it? So I enrolled in a 4-year doctoral program at Fuller and spent 4 years researching the building blocks for women and men working together. So if a partnership is going to be healthy and safe and life-giving, what are the building blocks that need to be present for that partnership to flourish? And graduated in 2018, and the last 4 or 5 years have been about writing the book and then just making the rounds. And I can just tell you, Carla, God has opened all these doors for me to meet with pastors and churches, denominations, and other organizations. And it's been a real joy to do training and coaching and consulting on that. And it's a joy to be with you all today. So again, thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Absolutely. Yes, it's definitely a topic I think maybe is becoming more of a buzz topic among denominations. And as I'm asking you questions, I want to invite any of our listeners, if you have a question, this isn't just for the two of us to have a conversation. I told Rob, be ready for anything. So if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat and I will do my best to interject those. But I have a few questions that I've written down, so pardon me for reading. But in your book, Together in Ministry, you use the word flourishing to describe this partnership between men and women. And flourishing is another buzzword right now. So how would you define flourishing in the context of women and men in ministry partnership?
Sure. Well, it is a buzzword for sure, right? Someone needs to do a study on how many books have been published over the last 6, 7, 8 years with flourishing either in the title or the subtitle, right? So I get that. At the end of my research process, I sifted my data, a qualitative research process, sifted all these transcripts and sat with these focus group interviews I did and just tried to understand what flourishing means in that context of women and men working together. And two dimensions of flourishing emerged from that process. One is that there's personal satisfaction. So more often than not, at the end of the day, you go home having worked together, just grateful for the chance to work together, that the partnership is life-giving and fruitful and joyful, and that you're friends and you're working together in that way. So personal satisfaction would be one dimension of flourishing. The other one is missional effectiveness. So people told me lots of stories about how, that the product, the ministry product, whatever that is, evangelism outreach or a discipleship meeting or a sermon, the product was better because the women and men were working together well, right? So it's those sort of two dimensions. And I have a graphic that I would show. So I think
please, so we would love to see that.
Yeah. So it's up on the screen. It should be up on the screen, and it's basically a 2x2 matrix, right? So on one axis, the x-axis, it's missional effectiveness. On the y-axis, it's personal satisfaction. And there's 4 dimensions, there's 4 quadrants within this 2x2 matrix, and you can see it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll walk you through it briefly. Number one, if personal satisfaction is low and missional effectiveness is low, I ask the question, well, why? Why would you want a partner, right? Not only is this not a life-giving partnership for you, but nothing's really getting done because of it. So why? Quadrant 2 and quadrant 3 are good, but not all they could be. So in quadrant 2, personal satisfaction is high. So you're functioning as friends. It's a fun partnership to be a part of. But still, it's not all it could be because nothing's happening missionally because of the partnership. And then down in quadrant 3, it's the reverse. So missional effectiveness is high. Your coworkers, your colleagues, and that's a good thing, and stuff's getting done. But personal satisfaction is low, and so you're not getting everything out of the partnership you could be. And so the goal in any 2x2 matrix is the 4th quadrant up and to the right, which is where I call flourishing mixed gender ministry partnerships. So this idea that personal satisfaction is high and missional effectiveness is also high. And, Carla, one of the things that people watching this can do is they can think about partnerships that they have with someone of the opposite gender, and they can locate that partnership on the graph, right? And sort of say, where is it? Is it a quadrant 2 kind of thing, quadrant 3? Maybe it's in quadrant 1, or maybe it's in quadrant 4. So you can locate it on that graph, and then as we're talking, you can think about what would help that particular partnership move towards quadrant 4, which is the goal, right? So that's how I think about flourishing. It's personally satisfying, it's missionally effective. And, if you've been in a quadrant 4 partnership with someone of the opposite gender, then it is just such a life-giving, safe, wonderful space where it's just a joy to be on mission together, right? So hopefully folks on the call get to experience that at some point if they're not already.
Absolutely. And when I think of my own, I'm a ordained minister in the Wesleyan Church, and I can think of some of those quadrant 4 relationships, but I also think of sometimes when maybe there was fear or lack of, how do I do this? That kind of brings people to stay in quadrant 1. And so, when I think about the Wesleyan Church, we have this long history of celebrating women and men serving together and empowering women in leadership. But I continue to receive, some pushback that that's not enough. Why is the things that we have said, we're one of the first to ordain a female. We've always celebrated. It's never been a question. So why is our history not enough when we talk about this flourishing conversation?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe I'll answer it in two parts. So the first thing I'd say is I mean, you know better than I. I'm a newcomer to the Wesleyan community, but it is a joy to read your history on this topic of women and men working together, right? I was doing some reading the other day, and I was a history major as an undergrad, and my focus in particular was on early American women's history. And I was struck by the fact that the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, I think, was hosted in a Wesleyan chapel. Like that is amazing to me as a history major. I love that. And what it says is you've invested, indeed, you're right, you've invested in women for your whole history, and it's a beautiful thing. I think I saw somewhere it's 150 years of women being ordained and preaching in the denomination, which is no small thing. So I think on one hand, you definitely want to celebrate that. I mean, you want to honor that legacy. You want to honor that history. You want to thank the Lord for that foundation. I think I saw on the website maybe that there's preacher Sundays happening.
Preacher month this
Yeah.
month right now. Yes.
Right. So hopefully congregations even right now are just looking at that history and celebrating that because it's a great gift that God has given to your community. So that's one thing to say. The second thing though to say is I think you don't want to rest on your laurels, which is a phrase, sort of just to like say, we have done this, we've always done this, and so we're good. Like you don't want to be in that place. And I think I'll just share this experience from InterVarsity. When I interviewed a number of women as a part of my research process, they told me that they are so grateful for InterVarsity's history and InterVarsity's present experience of being a woman on the team where they can exercise leadership in any capacity. They're so grateful for that. And then they said this, they said, but sometimes we rest on those laurels. Basically, we don't keep pushing for more and more access for women, for better sort of roles for women in the organization, for more partnership between women and men in ministry. And it really struck me. So I think I'd say the same thing to you all as I would say to my own organization, which is you have to keep pushing. One of the things I experience as I make the rounds and do my coaching and consulting and training is I see a gap between what we say we value, so women can exercise leadership in all capacity, women and men designed to be partners, and then what we practice. So the day in, day out lived experience, particularly of women in ministry. And there's a gap between these two things, between value and practice. And I think that gap is going to vary depending on maybe where you sit within the denomination or your particular church. But that gap is probably present. And so one of the ways I think about what I do is I try to help bridge that gap, right? So where there's a gap, let's try to close it so that our practice and our values more closely and fully align. So maybe one of the questions I would ask to folks on the call is like, do you see that gap and what's causing it, right? If you're able to discern that and put words to what's causing that gap, then you can start to design ways to cross the gap, to close the gap, to bridge the gap. And that's hopefully where some of the topics in my book would come in handy as well. So all that to say, just to affirm the history and legacy of the Wesleyan denomination, it is a beautiful God-given thing, and keep pushing.
Absolutely. The statistics are constantly updating, but I believe it was a 2011 group from the Wesleyan Church did a task force study and found that we had 89 ordained women, and 3 years ago we had 490 ordained women, and so that just that's a growth. And to see, we've never not ordained women, but to see the growth in the conversation and the growth. But yet, but there's always that yet.
Yes.
We run up against some things, and this is kind of a little story leading into this next question I have. So yes, in the Wesleyan Church for September, we're calling it Preach Her month, and inviting every Wesleyan church to have a woman preach. And for many Wesleyan churches, they don't have a female on staff, so they may bring on a guest. And I was invited to be a guest preacher this past Sunday, and a gentleman come up to me, very warm, very inviting, and said, I don't really know if I agree with this, so I wanted to be here today and see what it's all about. Well, no pressure, right? Like,
Right.
see what it's all about. But there's this kind of practical, what does this look like? Because we know that there's pushback. We know that although we've said in the Wesleyan Church, and we celebrated empowering women, that there's the espoused theory and then there's the lived reality. So if you were to think of just maybe getting really practical, I'm going to read this question.
Okay.
How would you encourage the leaders and pastors on this call? Where would you encourage them to start building flourishing partnerships in their own lives? And specifically, women, they are given a seat at the table. How can we encourage their voices? Kind of like my experience Sunday, where I felt like, hey, I'm representing all these women and I have to prove to this gentleman why it's okay. But I also would never want to undermine the value of the men that I would serve with. So what are some practical words that you would share for the leaders listening in?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there. So let me start with the first one, then remind me, Carla, to come back to the
Absolutely.
question about the women at the table. I think with the first one, in terms of like what people can do practically in their individual partnerships or interpersonal partnerships they have with people, there's a few things that come to mind. So one would be, I think we want to be doing our inner work and being as healthy as we possibly can in our own selves regarding how we look at the other gender as we engage well, right? So I think for men and women on the call to say like, what's God doing in me to overcome and bring healing to issues of brokenness that might be present, right? So I think when I did my interviews, a lot of men told me stories about, dealing with some of the sexual sin and things like that, but they also talked about how they'd been encultured to view women in negative ways and some biases that they brought to the table, right? And then women told me stories about trying to recover from what it's the experience of being objectified or marginalized, right? And so I think we always want to be doing our inner work so that we can engage our ministry partners in as healthy a way as humanly possible, right? So that's probably the place I would start, is this sort of internal work. I think one of the questions that's helped me and guided me as I've done some of that inner work in my own life has been, it's a bit of an examine kind of a question. So I'll just offer that, which is, how is my gendered identity, so as a man, how is my gendered identity flawed and in need of redemption? And then how is my view of, in my case, women, flawed and in need of redemption? And if you can honestly answer that question and sit with the Lord around that, and then maybe bring people into your life to inform that with you and walk with you through that, I think you're on your way toward sort of expositing what's happening internally and functioning in a more healthy way. So I think the first thing I'd say is do your inner work. The second thing I would say is, I think a lot of this gets worked out in the day in, day out interactions we have with each other. I mean, we talk about closing that gap between value and practice. There are structural things we could talk about. There are organizational culture things we can talk about. There are theological things we could talk about. But I think a lot of this is worked out interpersonally, right? So, and the way I talk about that in my book is the idea of a learner's posture. So when people have this curiosity to understand another person's experience, and when they've developed some tools and skills to walk in their ministry partner's shoes, I think partnerships are more likely to flourish, right? So So it's asking good questions and it's engaging well as people are sharing. It's like good eye contact and after, nodding to understand and paraphrasing and things like that. Basic listening skills, right? But I think that's just a baseline kind of thing to say to someone, tell me about your world. You might need to ask for permission. Hey, would it be okay if I ask you about your experience, as a woman in ministry or whatever? But like asking about that and then really listening to those answers and walking a mile in your ministry partner's shoes does of wonders for the personal satisfaction metric, and then I think also for the missional effectiveness metric. The more you know about someone, the better it's going to be in terms of your partnership. So that's a second idea, is this idea of sort of a learner's posture. And then I think maybe one other thing I'll share in terms of like things that people can do individually is, how are you talking about the other gender, right? How are you talking, in my case, how am I talking about women? Um, and I try to be really careful with my words around this, right? So if someone says to me, like, that girl over there, I'll say, she's a woman, right? Just to correct that, right? Just to say, this matters. Like, we need to view her as a woman. Or like another example would be, I was in a church recently and the pastor got up front and shared a joke about how women are so emotional all the time. And I just sat there thinking, okay, he got a lot of laughs for that joke, but what damage did he do here, right? So, for example, if you're a woman like my wife, Amy, who's not wired that way, she sits there thinking, well, then is there something wrong with me, Pastor? Or I sit there as a guy who is wired that way, who's very emotionally driven. I sit there and I think, wait a second, like that joke should apply to me. Like it's just a weird dynamic, right? So maybe my third encouragement would be, how are we talking about the opposite gender? Are we honoring, the men and women that we work with by being careful with what we say and how we say it? So those would be three thoughts. I could keep going, but those are three thoughts for you and for the listeners around kind of things that people can do interpersonally. Right. Is that good? And let me come back to the question you asked. Can you ask it again? Actually, that would be helpful.
Yeah, before I ask it again, I was thinking as you were talking, just I've had this conversation with my husband. I think a lot of like media, sometimes there's certain like shows or movies that portray the man as like, always screwing up, or the dad's always getting it wrong. And, we're talking about the church, not media, but we are so influenced by those little messages. So it's, I think, not even how we view the opposite sex, but the messages we're listening to, and how that influences us. Even some of my kids' favorite cartoons, Peppa Pig was so fun, and they actually started talking in British accents after watching that show too much. But the father was always screwing up, and I had to kind of think, do I really want my kids to have that message about genders? So I really appreciate that.
Just real quick, Carla, my kids they roll their eyes because we'll be watching, like, let's say for example we watch the Super Bowl, the kids are watching for the halftime show and they like the treats, right? But at every commercial break there'll be a commercial, and I'll after the commercial's over, I'll say, okay kids, what was that ad trying to say to you about, and then fill in the blank, right? And often it's about gender roles, or who men and women are, and we'll do a debrief of the commercial after each and every one, and then eventually the kids are like, yeah, I'm out of here, I don't want to be a part of it. That's too much, he's too serious, I just want to watch the game anyway. So I do think there is, you're right to say that there's these messages we're getting bombarded with all the time, and that's why you have to do that inner work to interrogate your biases and surface those so you can work with those and deal with those. Yeah.
Absolutely. My second question was, but I have one that I didn't write down. So after I ask it, I'm going to look at my paper and write it down while you're answering this one. The second question was, what are some practical steps women can take to help their voices be heard at the table with men without undermining the value that the men bring to the table?
Yeah. Well, maybe two things I'll say on this one. I think the first one is to sort of maybe take a half step back and say, I think women and men together have work to do to try to understand what's happening below the surface, like in a meeting or in an event or something where where there's dynamics happening, right? So in my book, I have a whole chapter on what I call adverse gender dynamics. There's 27 examples in the book of things that trip up women in organizational life, and they're subtle, but they're powerful. So in other words, they sort of lurk below the surface, but they cause damage to women and they push women to the margins in community life. And I think the premise of that chapter is when a community has eyes or radar to see those under the surface dynamics, then they can work to mitigate them. And so I think even before the question of like, what should a woman do in that situation, maybe the question I'd ask is like, what's the team doing to work together to spot those dynamics and then mitigate them, head them off at the pass, so to speak, right? I was interviewing a group for my research project, and they told me that at any moment in any meeting, any person on the team can call timeout if they're perceiving some under the surface dynamics that are unhealthy or not helpful for the team. And I was like, whoa, that strikes me as a really inefficient way to run a meeting, right? That was my first instinct. And they were like, sure, but it's gotten better over time because the reality is we are committed as a team to expositing what's happening under the surface, and we learn from that. And so then down the road, 10 meetings from now, it's going to be that much better and easier, right? So I just appreciate that sort of value for, well, debrief for one, but for two, this idea that we're going to look for the things under the surface that trip up in this conversation, trip up women, and we're going to do what we can to resolve those, right? So I think that's sort of the prior thing for me is like, what's the ethos in the community around paying attention to those dynamics and trying to help them. In terms of what the woman does in that moment, even the moment you talked about, Carla, with your story, I think a couple things. I mean, one, I think for women who are in an environment where maybe they're the only woman at the table or there's just a couple of women at the table, like, what's your support system like? So are people praying for you? Are people caring for you, checking in with you afterward, sort of like debriefing with you? I think that's probably one question is what's the support system like could be from within the church or the system, or it could be from outside that as well. But I want to make sure as women step into that people are caring for them. The second thing would be like, are there allies? So especially I think for a woman who's going into a new environment, maybe has just joined a team or something, who are the men and the women at the table who would really be allies for them? And I think identifying those and thinking about those, I think, is an important consideration. And maybe a third thought would be just to exhort women to just keep pushing. I mean, it's back to what we said earlier, right? To keep pushing. I think we've tried to do church, by and large, we've tried to do church with half the team, the women, put on the bench, right? Like, not on the playing field, on the bench when it comes to issues like preaching and executive leadership in the church and things like that. And we've done that for too long. And I think about how many missed opportunities has the church had because we functioned in that way, right? And so as we reimagine church, as we rethink church to include the full participation of women, I just, we need you. we need the women on this call to exercise their gifts, to use their voice, right? And so my encouragement would be push through the barriers, internal, external barriers, and let's hear from you. We need it.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's several studies. Carolyn Moore did a study, When Women Lead, as her book, and very similar conversation of, we recognize that about 50% of churches worldwide do not empower women to lead. So we're missing 50% of the voice in those situations, and to how much more can we flourish, to use your example, when women and men are both given that opportunity. And I love that. But here's my follow-up question with that. And again, I'm not the only one asking questions. So if you have a question, shoot it in there. And as Rob's been mentioning in his book, don't forget to fill out that form. It was, we had an issue, it's fixed now. Fill out that form so you can get a free copy. But as we think about that,
Mhm.
And again, I'm just going to get personal. Wouldn't want to share somebody else's story. My husband and I are both ordained Wesleyans. We were ordained at the same service. We co-pastored for many years before I was given this leadership opportunity. And so it was normal for us, but we were husband and wife. And so no one questioned that. But now my husband, as lead pastor, has an executive pastor that's a female and has a high level volunteer that's a female. And he said to me just this morning, I hope you talk about how do we shift the culture and the perspective of the laity in the church, because for so many years they've heard you never, men can't be alone with women, and like if and there's all these dangers, and for sure there have been moral failures, and as you mentioned earlier, there are unfortunate incidences where there's an abuse of power, and there is some type of abuse, but in healthy flourishing situations, what maybe advice or practical tip would you give someone like my husband who wants to celebrate, who wants to work side by side, but there's a perception from the church members at large that that might not be healthy or okay? What would you say in those situations?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. I think as with anything, I've never been like a church pastor, ordained pastor, so I've my disclaimer there. But I think the pastors I know, there's a disciple making process that needs to happen in the church with a whole host of issues, and I would just say this is one of those, right? So take your congregation on a journey
Mm.
of exploring the scriptures on the topic of women in leadership, on the topic of women and men in partnership, host conversations about that. I think one of the things I've realized as I've made the rounds, Carla, is that a lot of people in the pews and elsewhere have a value for women in leadership, or they have a theology of women in leadership, but they have not done the work themselves in the texts to understand where that value comes from. So this might be a place where I really encourage people to open the scriptures and let the Spirit guide the community into an exploration of what the scriptures say about this, right? Again, I think we've breathed, whatever context you've grown up in, you've breathed the air of the theological air, so to speak, around this. But I would encourage people to just, and I realize there's a crowded church calendar and all of that, but I think as a pastor, your job is to guide people through the scriptures on that. So make space for the Spirit to speak, good study, good resources, all the hallmarks of a good Bible study process, and let the church kind of work its theology out. And then as you do that, you can talk about the more practical ramifications of this, right? So this is why my executive pastor is a woman. This is our covenant together before you all, how we're going to operate with integrity. I mean, it sort of opens the door to all of those conversations about how you function in your church culture. But I think you want to start maybe with the theology piece and make sure that the group is that the community is on the same page around that. So does that make sense in terms of like you're taking the church
Absolutely.
on a journey? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would interject two thoughts for
Yeah.
our listeners. You have that scriptural basis in your book. We didn't cover it today because we're going to just assume listeners are coming from a Wesleyan background, knowing that, but that's in the book. But then also, I'm going to throw this out there. We have these beautiful blue books called why Wesleyans Celebrate Women in Ministry, and they're in both English, Spanish, same book. And we'll send those to you. So if you're listening and you want that, I did not prep my team ahead of time for this, but if you're listening and you want that for your church, because it has scriptural, theological, and would be just like Rob was sharing. So between his book and that Wesleyan pamphlet book, so put in the chat if you would like that, and we'll make sure to get that sent to you. And so, sorry, I had to put that plug out there. The more we can teach and educate. This problem I don't think will ever go away. I think there will always be this gender struggle with some wondering, can women and men serve together and flourish and be healthy? But I think that we are making progress, and resources like your book are helping with that. But there's one more piece to this that I want to ask about. When we think about, you know, a faith community or a denomination, and you worked with several. So Rob was just telling me before the call the other denominations he's working with just recently. So he's very ecumenical. How might, maybe on a larger scale, how might an organization or a faith community nurture flourishing partnerships in their in the wider circle? I know you talked a little bit about that, but how could we see that broaden outside of the leader and the person they're working with to now broaden it bigger?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts on this one, and there's a lot I could say on this. I mean, the book is about this in a lot of ways, but I think one would be I think you want to start by understanding reality, assessing your reality. I think I teach organizational dynamics classes at Fuller Seminary, and I always start with this one. Before you go making changes, you want to understand what's already present in the system, right? So giving attention to that and having a little bit, I mean, some would call it like a SWOT analysis, if that term's familiar, or just a moment to sit with like a leadership team, or maybe it's a more broader group, to say like, what's happening with the gap between our value and our practice? How would we describe that? Why is that gap in place? What are the pitfalls that are tripping us up from fully living out our value, right? And I think having a frank conversation about that, an honest conversation about that, is probably the place to start, Carla, because you don't want to apply fixes until you've understood the problem. And so I think I would encourage folks to start there, and you can ask the question as you sort of exposit what's happening in your system. You can ask the question like, well, where are the soft spots for change here? Like, where are the places where we could strategically apply energy and see change? And like I said earlier, I think there's a lot of bridges that would cross the gap between value and practice. One of them is theological. We just talked about that. Another would be like around organizational culture. Another one might be structural. Like, are there women on your leadership team, on your elder team, on your leadership team? If not, that might be a structural issue, or it might be interpersonal, and there's probably a few other bridges we could talk about. But I think understanding which solution to apply requires understanding why the gap is there and what it looks like. So I think assess your reality would be the first thing I talk about. The second thing, encouragement I would give folks, is to create safe spaces to talk about this stuff. To talk about theology, to talk about the dynamics of women and men working together. You mentioned earlier the Billy Graham rule, which is Billy Graham had a rule that he was never going to be alone with a woman that wasn't his wife. And that rule has become, sometimes I call it the 11th commandment in a lot of churches around the world, right? Well, one of the things that came out of my research is that the Billy Graham rule has brought with it some negative consequences for women. So can we create spaces to talk about that, right? Like, why would we follow this rule? Is this actually the rule we want to follow? So just having those conversations. And I think that's just a crucial skill to create safe and thoughtful space for people to have conversations that they don't normally have, that feel taboo. I think one of the things I've realized as I've done a lot of work with this recently is that the church tends to have a culture of silence. Too often, a culture of silence around these topics of women and men working together, or sex, or just any of these sort of topics within that sort of umbrella around gender. And I think the reality is people are kind of hungry to have these conversations. And if we don't create in the church, don't create safe spaces to have these conversations, people are going to go elsewhere where the conversations are happening. And so sometimes I like to, when I'm with a group of pastors, I'll say something like, would you rather your people get discipled by TikTok or by your church, right? And so I think just creating safe space to have conversations about things that matter would be a second step. And then maybe one other thing I'll say, in terms of like a prescriptive for a church or a community to move forward, is to think about the representation. So I have a whole chapter on this in my book, but the idea is when you've put your public value or your value on public display in tangible ways, women and men are more likely to have flourishing partnerships. It's just the reality. So what does your worship service look like? Who's on the preaching roster? Who's in the room when people are making decisions about the future of the church? right? Who's on the worship team? Who's what pictures are on your website? And do all of those things reflect your value, your 150-year-old value for women in leadership and men and women in partnership? I was doing an interview with someone, and she told me this story about how whenever they plan an event, her team, whenever they plan an event, at the end, when they're done planning and the Google Docs look great and everything, they go back and they force themselves to answer some questions
Mm.
having to do with representation. So have we thought about gender representation, ethnic representation, right? Just all of those categories. And I think that's a really helpful practice to sort of say, here are all the things we do. Are they embodying the values we say we espouse, right? And so I think be intentional about representation as you think about all those levels of the church. So those would be three encouragements for people.
So here's not pushback, but I'd
Yeah.
love to pick your brain on that third one. Many of our churches in the Wesleyan denomination are smaller. They're one staff, one lead senior pastor. And so in those situations where, well, we can't have a rotation of our pastors, including females, because we don't have one, how does a church that's smaller and limited on who they have available, how do they address the representation? Again, speaking from my own experience, sometimes I was the only female available, so I was often asked, and other authors have talked about kind of this, sometimes qualified women are over asked because
Sure.
it's like, oh, she's good, and so everybody asks the same one. How do we in our smaller churches led by men, and they're doing amazing things, how would you encourage them to have that representation when there's not a female on staff?
Yeah, it's a great question, Carl. Thanks for asking that. I mean, I think my response to that, the short answer would be pastors in that situation can build teams and mentor and raise up women to be at a point eventually where they are in the are qualified to be in the pulpit. So I think and I'll tell you a story. So there's a local church in one of the towns where I supervise the university staff, and they were in the same boat. So they wanted to express this value for women in leadership, but it's just one guy on the staff, and that's just how it had been for years. And so he created a cohort of promising leaders who had demonstrated some degree of spiritual maturity, some degree of maybe some word gifts, like they were the stars of the Bible studies, right? They had some skills in speaking, and he gathered them, and they just spent time together over the span of, I don't know what it was, maybe 9 months of every other week meeting and talking about stuff. They would read books together, right? And then eventually, I think as it came closer to the time when he was hoping to have some of these folks in the pulpit, they would do specific training on preaching, right? So there's books to read on that, or they'd write sermons and present them to each other. And it was just this really collaborative kind of experience. And so I remember the day when he got up front, the lead pastor, and said, there's a woman who's been in this group for 9 months, and I'm so excited for her to be in the pulpit today. I'm excited to receive from her personally, and I'm excited that we all get to receive. And he sort of laid the groundwork for that, and off she went, and she preached an amazing sermon. So I think if the possibility of like bringing in someone from a nearby church or flying Carla to your parish or something, if that's not possible, then probably my question is, how can you generate from within a group of women and men who are able to eventually be in the pulpit? I think start now.
And it's a long game.
Yeah.
Leadership development always is, and really that's part of what you're talking about is leadership development, where it's not exclusive, but you recognize that God will use both the men and the women. But in some of my conversations, specifically with women or with some men that have experienced the frustration of the resistance to men and women serving together, they want a solution right now. They want everybody to embrace it and everyone to accept it right now. And the reality is that's just not how it works. As you read through Rob's book, after you guys request it, don't forget, request your free book. You'll see that these solutions aren't, okay, put your dollar in and you get this prize. It takes effort. And the one thing that I have seen from the frustration is people giving up. And
Mm.
so, and saying, this is not a fight that I feel like we can win. So like, why try? And so I don't know if I can put you on the spot, but if somebody was thinking, is this worth the fight? Because this isn't going to be solved in a day. Is this worth the push, the training, the discipleship? How would you respond to somebody that is just not sure this is a conversation worth pushing? When
Yeah.
there's so many other things, we've got millions and billions of people that are lost and don't know Jesus, and the church is and struggling here and there. Like, why is this conversation worth our time?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. I mean, to me, it's about, so there's a lot of ways to think about this. I mean, one of the ways I think about women stepping into leadership in the church is like a justice thing. Like it's been unjust, in my
Mm.
view, that for 2,000 years women have been largely relegated to the sidelines. Like that's unjust, and God is a God of justice, and so it would be right for us to move forward in this for that reason, right? Or I mean, there's a let me just tell a story about my daughter. So my daughter Lucy is, everyone listening would want her in your congregation. She's full of life. She's curious. She's up for any challenge. She's willing to be a part of the community. But the fact is, she's not going to go to a church because this is such a value for her. And she's had her dad and mom that have been talking about this forever at Super Bowl commercials and all that. She's not going to be in a church that doesn't affirm the full partnership of women. And if she goes to the church and doesn't see that from up front, she's out the door, right? And I don't think Lucy's alone. There's a generational aspect to this, Carla, where I think Gen Z, which is today's college students, my kids, that era, are pretty aware, socially aware of what's happening and the dynamics and all of that. And so I think it's a missiological issue for me. It's a justice issue. It's a missiological issue for me. Do we want to reach Gen Z? If so, let's roll up our sleeves and put in the work to change how we operate in the church so that especially women, but also men, can find their way into our churches, look up at the pulpit and see a pulpit that reflects their value for partnership and their value for social conscience, all of that, right? So I think it's a missiological thing, it's a justice thing, it's the right thing to do, I think theologically. So there's all those reasons. Let me just close with this. Sometimes people ask me, like, are there themes that weave throughout your whole model? And I didn't show you the model, but it's in my book, you can read it. And there's two themes I like to talk about. The first one is what you just said in the lead into this question, intentionality. We're gonna have to be intentional, right? It's not just, learner's posture is not just gonna happen. You're gonna have to work at that, right? Representation, not just gonna happen. You're gonna have to work at that. And so it's gonna require sort of that energy, that chutzpah to push. And then the second thing I talk about often in this question is courage. So it's going to take courage on the part of every pastor on this call to take that 150 years of Wesleyan tradition and live it out day in and day out, because there's going to be pushback. There's old habits die hard in the church. There's, what they call them, sacred cows, right? There's all of that would be potentially in our way. And so it's going to take courage to reimagine how we do church. And so when I pray for a group like the Wesleyan denomination or any other group I'm working with, that's what I'm praying for. Intentionality and just a special blessing and outpouring of courage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And the story after story that I receive, and especially this Preach Her month, has really brought up some conversations. And we've had churches that are just like booming and flourishing. And there's this one church in Indiana that they have a female every Sunday and every Sunday night and every Wednesday. It's a Hispanic church, and they're just knocking it out of the park, celebrating, and they're raising up women. Then we have had some others that, nope, we're not part of that. We don't want to do that. And that intentionality, and sometimes I feel like a broken record, and I'm sure you do too, talking about this same thing over and over. But if we're not talking about it, people won't think it's important.
Yes.
And that's how I would encourage anyone on the call, is we talk about it, because you talk about the things that matter. And This isn't because women are amazing. This is because God created men and women in his image to
Yes.
flourish together.
Amen. Amen.
Any final words that you want to share with us? I don't think we have had any questions. I think what that means is you have answered everyone's question before they have asked it.
Yes.
And not to beat a dead horse, if I can use that expression, but please go ahead and fill out that form for Rob's book. Rob did not pay us to say all of those things. It's just a really great resource. And if this is a topic that you care about, or if it's a topic that your church says, yeah, of course, for our church, my local Wesleyan church, that's just part of our culture. And it's been part of our culture long enough that it's not really questioned as much, if at all. But we want this to be a resource for you. So I say that the Wesleyan Celebration of Women, that pamphlet, that's available to you, as well as Rob's book. But as we close, Rob, there's so much in the book that we couldn't cover, and that's why we want everybody to read it. But do you have any closing remarks that you would like to share with us?
Sure. Well, just one thing about the book. I think my greatest hope is that communities would read that book together. So if you get a copy, let me just encourage you, share it with your crew or whoever you work with, whoever you partner with, because I think it's going to be most useful, I think, if you read it in community and talk about it. And there's questions at the end of every chapter that can fuel and catalyze your conversation. Maybe one more thought, just a little bit from a pastoral angle, Carla, and that is, I think when we think about change, and again, this Professor Dixon hat, sorry, but when we think about change, we think about big things, right? Like a theological change or changing the culture tomorrow. I think it's okay to start small. This gets maybe back to what we talked about just a minute ago with the cohort I was telling you about. I think it's okay to start small and to make small changes and then progressively bigger changes and then bigger and bigger, and you're sort of pushing a flywheel and getting it moving quicker and quicker and quicker. But I think it's okay to start small. So to listeners out there, you don't need to change everything about your church tomorrow. Right. You can start with a conversation with someone that you work with. You can start with asking a question about representation the next time you have a planning meeting. You can start with just sort of, how's our theological statement? Maybe I need to do some reading. You can start small and let that be sort of something that then builds momentum for something greater. So that'd be my encouragement to folks. Don't leave this call overwhelmed that you need to change everything tomorrow. Take it slow, but keep pushing, right?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Rob. As you're processing what this looks like, maybe reading and studying Rob's book with others, if you have any questions or thoughts, or I wasn't sure, or this just hit me, I'd love to hear from you. And so you can find my contact information on our website, or my email, or however you want to reach out. But we don't host these webinars just to inform you. We want to work and partner with you. So if there is a way we can do that, never hesitate to reach out, because we want to flourish together, the men, the women, serving God for his glory, because we were created in his image to serve him and to love him together. So thank you, Rob, so much. Again, I want to remind you that you can reach out with that form. There is a cutoff, so just go ahead and do that right now for the free copy of the book, as well as letting us know. And although Rob's book is limited time, the Wesleyan Celebration of Women pamphlet is always available. And so you reach out to our office, education@wesleyan.org, and let us know how we can serve you by getting you copies of that for your congregation. Next month, I do want to invite you on October 31st. It's a Tuesday, 1 o'clock is our next webinar. And we're going to be meeting with Brenda Jenk, who founded the organization Run Hard, Rest Well. And we're going to be digging into, we work hard and we're called to work hard, but that also means we are called to a rhythm of rest, just as God ordained it. So we invite you to join us 1 p.m. Eastern Time, October 31st. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We hope you have a blessed day. Bye-bye.